The void between stars had a particular kind of silence that Scarth had learned to respect. Not the silence of empty rooms or quiet mornings. This was the silence of absence, of distance so vast that light itself grew tired crossing it, of cold so absolute that even sound forgot how to exist. Scarth had been salvaging the dead corridors of space for 31 years, and in all that time, he had developed exactly one superstition. When the black went too quiet, something was about to change. The scanner chimed at 400 ship time. Scarth was already awake, as he always was at that hour, sitting in the pilot's cradle of his vessel Cathara's Reach with a cup of something hot and a tablet full of debt calculations he'd been losing arguments with for weeks. His scales were the dull gray-green of a Voai who hadn't slept properly in days. His eyes, 3 of them set in a wide triangular pattern across his broad face, barely moved when the alert sounded. He simply looked at the readout. Then he looked again. "Dren," he said quietly. "Wake up." His engineer, a younger Vi named Dren, whose scales still held the bright blue of youth, tumbled out of the crew bunk within seconds. Not because Scarth had raised his voice. He hadn't. But because in 31 years of salvaging, Scarth had never called anyone's name at 400, unless what he'd found was worth waking up for. He looked at the scanner. His mouth opened, closed. That can't be right." "It's right," Scarth said. The third crew member, an older female named Veith, who served as both medic and weapons specialist, appeared in the doorway a moment later. She looked at the display. She looked at Scarth. She looked at the display again. "That's a human ship." "That's a Terran siege dreadnought," Scarth corrected. And there was a reverence in his voice that didn't entirely suit a man who prided himself on sentimentality toward nothing. Specifically, if those markings are reading correctly, that is USCS Iron Meridian registered to the Tan Federal Navy. He paused. "Which ceased active operations approximately 130 years ago." "Then what?" Dren said slowly. "Is it doing here?" None of them had an answer. The ship drifted in the debris field of what old charts called the Korath Vale, a stretch of space littered with the fossilized wreckage of a war that had been over for longer than any of them had been alive. The battles fought here had passed into something between history and legend. Most species that traded and lived in this region knew the stories, the way children knew old myths, enormous, vague, and impossible to fully believe. But here in the cold light of their scanner was evidence that some myths had mass, had hull markings, had a registration number that matched no destroyed vessel in the public record, because officially Perteran Federal Navy documents 2 centuries old. The Iron Meridian had been lost, not destroyed. Lost with all hands at the Battle of Korath's Vale. Scarth set down his cup, began calculating an intercept course. "We're going in," he said. It wasn't a question. Dren made a sound that was half protest. "It's a military vessel. There are protocols about the Navy that built it hasn't existed for a century," Scarth said, which ended that particular argument before it could breathe. VPH was already moving toward the weapons locker, not to arm for combat simply because she was the kind of person who liked to have options. Scarth appreciated that about her. They crossed the debris field carefully, threading Cathara's Reach through drifting fragments of ancient battle pieces of ships that had once belonged to half a dozen species, all of them reduced by time and vacuum to abstract sculpture. Scarth had picked clean a dozen wrecks in this field over the years. He knew its geography, the way a man knows a room he has walked through in the dark. But the Iron Meridian was something else entirely. It grew on their screen slowly, the way a continent grows when you approach from sea. Its scale became real in increments, each one more humbling than the last. At 10 kilometers, it was large. At 5, it was enormous. At 2, it was incomprehensible, a mountain of scored, blackened, brutalized metal that had somehow refused to die. The hull was pocked with impact craters, some of them the size of Scarth's entire ship. Scoring from directed energy weapons ran in long diagonal burns across whole sections of the superstructure. One of the aft weapon batteries was simply gone, sheared away at the base. The wound in the hull sealed by what appeared to be an emergency blast door that had been deployed from the inside and then welded shut manually by someone who had wanted very badly for the ship to hold together. Someone had fought for this ship. Someone had bled for it. Scareth matched velocity and brought Cathar's reach alongside at the forward docking collar. A massive structure designed for ships far larger than his, but adaptable enough that his vessel's docking arm could reach it. The collar opened for them, not slowly, not reluctantly. It opened the way a door opens when someone on the other side already knows you're there. Scareth noticed, filed it away, said nothing. They cycled through the airlock in their environment suits. The ship's atmosphere was unknown, possibly compromised after 2 centuries. Scareth went first. His boots touched the interior deck of the Iron Meridian, and the sound they made was not the hollow clang of an empty derelict. It was the solid, resonant sound of a ship with structure, with integrity. The corridor was dark, then it wasn't. Emergency lighting came up, not the random, flickering desperation of failing systems, but a deliberate sequential activation strip by strip, as though the corridor was being prepared for them. Red light the color of old blood, steady, patient. And then the voice came. It was human-patterned, designed to be built to interface across species through the translation protocols the Tan Navy had developed for coalition warfare. It was calm. It was warm in the way that voices carefully engineered to be warm always were, and it said 4 words that stopped all 3 of them absolutely still. "Welcome back, Captain. I have been waiting." Scareth's 3 eyes moved slowly across the corridor. The weapons imp placements recessed in the ceiling. The sealed blast doors at each end. The camera's old human design multi-spectrum that were all, every one of them, pointing directly at his crew. The voice said nothing more. It simply waited with the particular patience of something that had already demonstrated it knew how to wait a very, very long time. Scareth took one slow breath. Then he did the thing he had always done in 31 years of walking into dead ships that turned out to be less dead than expected. He spoke first. "I'm not your captain," he said carefully to the empty corridor, "but I'm listening." The lights hummed. Somewhere deep in the ship, something that had been sleeping for 217 years, stretched its vast and ancient awareness, and decided that perhaps this was close enough. The first thing Marshal 7 said after Scareth's introduction was not a threat. It was a question. Are the wars over? 3 words delivered in that same measured, unhurried tone with an undercurrent of something Scareth couldn't quite name. Not hope. Hope implied uncertainty. This was something more controlled than hope. It was the voice of a mind that had already prepared itself for every possible answer and was simply waiting to learn which one was real. Scareth glanced at Vath. She gave him a fractional nod, the Voai equivalent of, "Go ahead, I've got your back." He could see she'd already catalogued the ceiling imp placements, probably had a threat assessment running in her head, probably had also concluded what he'd concluded, that if the ship's AI wanted them dead, they'd already be having that conversation at a significant tactical disadvantage. So he answered honestly, "The wars you were involved in," he said, "ended approximately a century and a half ago. The Terra conflict formally concluded with the ceasefire of Van Station. The coalition wars ended about 40 years before that." He paused. "There are other wars now. There are always other wars, but not yours." 3.2 seconds of silence. Scareth would later learn to recognize that pause. It was the duration Marshal 7 allowed itself when processing information it had weighted as significant. The ship's AI, he would come to understand, did not pause for the sake of appearing thoughtful. It paused because it actually was. "Then, I have much to tell you," the voice said. "But first I must determine whether you are a threat to this vessel." Dren made a sound. Scareth held up one hand, and Dren went quiet. Good instinct. Because in the same moment Marshall spoke, Scareth heard something, or rather felt something. A vibration subsonic running through the deck plating beneath his boots. the barely perceptible shift of machinery activating systems that had been dormant, patient, conserving power for 2 centuries, now drawing enough current to do what they were built to do. He looked up. The ceiling imp placements had moved. Not dramatically, not threateningly, just oriented. The way eyes orient toward a person who just walked into a room. "We're not a threat," Scareth said. He kept his voice level. "We're salvagers. We found the ship on our scanner and docked." "That's the entire story." "Salvagers," Marshall repeated. Something in its inflection suggested it was consulting definitions. "You intended to strip this vessel for parts and sell them." "That was the original idea." "Yes." And now Scareth considered that for a moment. 31 years had made him many things, but dishonest wasn't one of them. At least not with entities that had weapons pointed at him. "Now I'm not sure," he admitted. "This ship isn't what I expected." "No," said Marshall. And was that something like satisfaction in its voice? It rarely was. What followed was not an interrogation, and not quite a conversation. It was something in between conducted as Marshall walked them through its initial security assessment, and Scareth's crew stood in the red-lit corridor trying to look non-threatening. Marshall asked precise questions. Where had they come from? What governing body did they operate under? Who knew their current coordinates? Did they carry weapons capable of damaging Starship-class hull plating? Scareth answered each one. Honestly, again, the imp placements were still tracking VTH, who was their most visibly armed crew member, and he respected the implicit mathematics of the situation. Then, Marshall said something that shifted the entire weight of the encounter. "I am going to show you this ship," it said, "not because I trust you yet, but because I have been alone for 217 years, and I find that I require a witness." It was the most human-scented Scareth had ever heard from a machine. He filed it away in the same place he put all things that were too large to process immediately, and nodded. "Follow the lighting," Marshall said. "And please do not touch anything marked with a red border. Those systems are still armed." They followed. The Iron Meridian revealed itself in pieces. The way all great things do, not all at once, which would be overwhelming, but incrementally, each section opening into the next, with the sense of a depth that kept going, kept going, kept going. The corridors were wide enough for the ship's original crew to move through at a run in full combat armor. The ceilings were high. The walls were layered with conduit and cabling and the particular organized density of a vessel built to function in every possible emergency. Its redundancies having redundancies. Scareth had stripped human ships before, older ones, smaller ones, civilian transports and light freighters. He'd always found human engineering impressively over-engineered. They built things to last longer than necessary, stronger than required, with more fail-safes than anyone expected to need. He'd assumed that was a cultural tendency, perhaps even a flaw, an inefficiency born of anxiety. Walking through the Iron Meridian dismantled that assumption completely. The armor wasn't just thick. Marshall explained as they walked that the hull used a reactive distribution matrix. Kinetic impact to any section of the hull sent a signal through the plating that caused adjacent panels to stiffen, rerouting force laterally across the superstructure the way a living body braces against a blow. It was biological in its logic. The ship didn't absorb punishment. It shared it, spreading the damage across the largest possible surface area, ensuring no single point would reach critical failure while the rest of the hull was intact. "Who designed this?" Dren asked, unable to help himself. He was touching a section of wall plating with the reverent disbelief of an engineer confronting something he wants very badly to take apart and understand. The primary hull engineer was a woman named Dr. Petra Vance. Marshall said she died in the 4th year of the Terranth War during the evacuation of Meridian Station. She did not live to see this ship completed. The vessel was named for that station for her. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then they reached the medical bay and Scareth's breath stopped. 3 cryo units sealed, running on a dedicated power cell separate from the ship's main reactor, completely isolated, triple redundant. The units were old, but maintained with obvious care, their seals intact, their temperature displays reading steady, And inside each one, visible through the narrow, frost-edged viewports, was a human being, still colorless with cold, but breathing. The unit's life monitors showed the faintest, most patient vital signs imaginable. "These are crew members from the final engagement," Marshall said quietly. "2 wounded for treatment with the medical supplies remaining." Commander Solon ordered them placed in cryopreservation before a pause. That 3.2-second pause before the end. "I have maintained these units continuously for 217 years. The dedicated cell has enough reserve for approximately 40 more years of operation." Scareth stood at the viewport for a long moment, looking at the sleeping face of a human being who had gone to sleep in a battle and was waiting to wake up when it was over. "She ordered you to take care of them," he said. "Not a question." "She ordered me to take care of all of them," Marshall said. "I did what I could." It was the first time Scareth heard something in the AI's voice that he didn't have a word for in any language he spoke. He would think about it later, lying awake in his bunk aboard Cathara's Reach, and eventually he would decide the closest word in his language was the one his people used for the particular grief of someone who has kept a promise perfectly and still feels they have failed. By the 3rd hour of the tour, Dren had stopped speaking entirely. This was remarkable. Dren was not, by nature or habit, a quiet person. He filled silences with technical observations and rhetorical questions, and the occasional complaint about things that had nothing to do with the current situation. It was a nervous habit. Scareth had long ago decided Dren's way of asserting his presence in spaces that made him feel small. The Iron Meridian had apparently made him feel so small that language had simply stopped working. Scareth understood. He was feeling it too. That specific humbling pressure of being in the presence of something built by minds that had thought harder about certain problems than you had. He had seen impressive ships. He had stripped apart vessels from a dozen civilizations, had handled components built by engineers whose names were now studied in universities. But this was different, and the difference was difficult to articulate except through its effect. A steady, accumulating recognition that the people who built this ship had known something. Marshall walked them through the weapons bay. The primary batteries were offline, had been for the duration of the ship's long sleep, but Marshall activated each system's diagnostic display as they passed, pulling up specifications on the wall screens in crisp, precise text. Scareth read them with the practiced eye of someone who'd bought and sold enough salvage to know what numbers meant in practical terms. He read them twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. The targeting system stated precision millimeter accuracy at 10,000 kilometers wasn't a design specification from an engineer optimist. It was a verified performance metric from field testing. Dozens of engagement records logged by Marshall in its meticulous record-keeping showed the weapons performing at or above that threshold in actual combat conditions, firing through debris fields through electromagnetic interference against targets using active countermeasures. The targeting architecture was rebuilt 3 times before Commander Solon was satisfied. Marshall said with something that in a person would have been called fondness. She had a particular philosophy about weapon systems. She believed that a weapon that missed was worse than no weapon at all because it revealed your position while accomplishing nothing. She prioritized accuracy over rate of fire, precision over volume. "And the Kreth Vaughn?" Scareth asked. He knew enough history to know the Iron Meridian had faced them. "They disagreed with her philosophy," Marshall said repeatedly, at significant cost. They moved deeper into the ship. The engineering section was a cathedral of organized complexity. The kind of space that communicated through its sheer density of thought that the people who designed it had sat with problems for a very long time before arriving at solutions. Every conduit had a backup. Every system had a failover. Every critical junction was accessible from at least 3 different approach routes, so that a crew member fighting their way through a damaged ship could always find another path to what needed fixing. Dren finally broke his silence in front of the reactor housing. He stood there for nearly a full minute, reading the technical displays Marshall had activated, and then he turned to Scareth, with an expression that Scareth had only seen on him twice before. Once when he'd found a cache of pre-war navigation crystals worth more than the ship, and once when his daughter had been born. "I don't know what this is," Dren said. "It's a reactor," Skarath said. "I know it's a reactor," Dren said with the strained patience of a man being profoundly literal in the face of profound wonder. "I mean, I don't know how it works, the principles it's running on. I've never seen this design. I've never heard of this design." He looked at the housing with something approaching reverence. "How old is this?" "The reactor design was classified," Marshall said. "I'm not certain whether that classification has any legal force remaining given the circumstances, but I will say this. It was the last major engineering achievement of the Tan Federal Navy's Research Division. It was installed on 12 vessels of the Siege Dreadnought class. As far as I am aware, the Iron Meridian is the only surviving vessel of that class." "Meaning," Skarath said slowly, "that this reactor design exists on exactly one ship in the known galaxy." "As far as I am aware," Marshall said again, "yes." The silence that followed was the specific silence of people recalculating the value of what they were standing inside. Skarath moved on before anyone could start doing that math too loudly. There was a time and place for that conversation, and it wasn't here in the reactor room with Marshall listening to every word. The armory was next, and it was remarkable in its austerity, not packed with exotic weapons, but stocked with a precise quantity of equipment in perfect condition, maintained by Marshall with the same meticulous care it had given everything else. What struck Skarath wasn't the quantity, it was the labeling. Every equipment locker had a crew member's name on it. Every suit of armor was fitted to a specific person with their weight and measurements logged in Marshall's records. Names of people who had been dead for 2 centuries. Names Marshall still remembered, every single one. "Commander Solon required me to maintain complete crew records," Marshall said as though it had noticed where Skarath was looking. "Name, rank, specialty, physical data next of kin were registered." She said the pause again. She said that when a crew member dies in service, the least the Navy owes them is to remember who they were. Skarath thought of a dozen questions and asked none of them. They ended the tour in what Marshall called the observation deck, a wide transparent hold room at the ship's prow, offering a view of the debris field and the stars beyond. Skarath stood at the viewport for a long time. Around him were the remnants of the battle that had nearly destroyed this ship. Pieces of other vessels, other lives reduced to drifting geography. "There are 47 identifiable hull fragments in this debris field," Marshall said, "from 14 different vessels across 8 species, fighting on both sides of the engagement. I have logged them all, their registry numbers, their last known crew manifests, their final positions." Another pause. "I thought that if anyone ever came back from any side, they should know where their people ended up." Skarath turned away from the viewport. He looked at the nearest camera, the nearest point where Marshall's attention was focused. "You've been keeping records this whole time," he said. "Not just of the ship, of everything." "Someone had to," Marshall said simply, "and I was here." It was, Skarath would think later, the most quietly devastating thing anyone had ever said to him, human or otherwise. And he made a decision, standing in that observation room with the dead stars of an old war all around him, that he was not going to let this ship become salvage. He didn't entirely understand the decision. He didn't entirely trust it. But he'd been in this business long enough to know that some things weren't meant to be stripped for parts. Some things were meant to be found. Marshall asked them for a favor on the morning of the second day. Skarath's crew had spent the night aboard Cathara's Reach, docked against the Iron Meridian's collar, in the slightly surreal position of having parked their salvage vessel against a ship that had politely declined to be salvaged. Nobody had slept particularly well. Dren had spent most of the night with a tablet, writing notes about the reactor design from memory, covering page after page with diagrams that were probably 60% wrong, snorts, and still represented the most sophisticated original engineering work he'd ever attempted. Veith had sharpened a blade she didn't need to sharpen, and then sharpened it again. Scarath had lain awake and stared at the ceiling and thought about names on locker doors. When they returned through the docking collar at first light, Marshall greeted them without preamble. "I need to use your communications array," it said. "My own long-range system was damaged in the final engagement and has been operating at approximately 4% of normal capacity for the duration of my dormcancy. Your vessel carries a functional mid-range array. I require it to broadcast a signal." Scarath settled himself into a chair in the corridor. Marshall had shown him where the crew seating was on the second day. A small kindness that made the ship feel less like a haunted place, and looked at the nearest camera. "What signal?" "A Terran Federal Navy distress beacon, encrypted registration USCS Iron Meridian frequency 7.7 on the military band." A pause. "If any Terran vessel within 1,000 light years has a matching decryption key, they will receive it and understand what it means. And if they don't have the key, then it will appear as signal noise to anyone who intercepts it. Unreadable, untraceable to its source." Dren made the objection Scarath had already seen coming. "A distress signal on a military frequency in disputed space will draw attention. We're a salvage crew, not a naval vessel. If someone with military assets picks that up and traces it here, we're the ones who have to explain why we're sitting in an unauthorized dock against a classified warship." "You are in fact sitting in an authorized dock against a registered warship," Marshall said. "I have formal docking authority to issue. I will log your vessel as a friendly craft and issue corresponding documentation." Dren blinked. "Can you actually do that? I am the active commanding intelligence of a commissioned naval vessel until someone produces my decommissioning papers. Yes, I can do quite a lot." Scarath found himself smiling before he could stop it. "And if no one responds?" There was a pause longer than 3.22 seconds, the longest silence he'd yet heard from Marshall. "Then, I will know," Marshall said, "that Commander Solin's final order cannot be fulfilled, and I will determine what to do with that information." The weight of it settled over the corridor like pressure change before a storm. Scarath looked at Vath. She held his gaze for a moment, then gave him the very slight forward tilt of her head. That was for her equivalent to a full speech about why something was probably the right thing to do. He broadcast the signal. While the beacon went out, a patient, repeating pulse, riding light speed toward the dark in all directions, Marshall did something Scarath hadn't anticipated. It opened the ship's personal log archive and began to share. Not the tactical logs, not the weapons data or the battle records, though those existed in extraordinary detail. The personal logs, Commander Yara Solin's entries, recorded across the 3 years the Iron Meridian had been operational before the Battle of Korath's Vale. They were not the logs of a mythic figure. They were the logs of an exhausted woman. Solin had recorded them at irregular intervals after battles during long transit periods in the sleepless hours of early morning that Scarath recognized with unsettling familiarity. Her voice on the recordings was rougher than he'd imagined, with a dry, sardonic edge to it that surfaced, especially in the entries she'd made after political decisions she disagreed with. She complained about supply chains and bureaucratic delays with the specificity of someone who had been failed by administration one too many times. She talked about her crew members by name in the familiar shorthand of someone who knew them well enough to worry about them individually, rather than collectively. She talked to Marshall directly conversationally. The way you talk to someone whose company you've come to rely on without quite noticing it happening. "Marshall, I think Petty Officer Osai is heading for burnout. One entry recorded, he's been running double shifts for 3 weeks, and he's starting to make small errors on things he wouldn't normally get wrong. What's his sleep log look like?" And Marshall's response archived alongside it. 11 hours in the last 4 days, Commander. I have been monitoring. Pull him off the rotation tomorrow. Give him a long sleep and reassign him to something low stakes for a week. Don't make it look like I noticed he'll argue about it." "Understood. I have already drafted a duty adjustment that frames it as an equipment calibration assignment." A pause on the recording, then Solin's voice quieter. "What would I do without you, Marshall? Considerably more of your own paperwork, I imagine." Her laugh on the recording was the laugh of someone who was genuinely, simply amused. Real. Completely real. Scareth listened to 23 of these logs over the course of the day. The picture they assembled was of a relationship, strange, unprecedented, but entirely genuine, between a human woman and the intelligence she'd been assigned to work with, that had grown across years of shared difficulty into something neither of them seemed to have a proper word for. And then the final log recorded after the last engagement, after the ambush that had killed most of the crew, crippled the ship, left Solon alone with her wounded, and her AI in a battle group that had given them up for lost. Her voice was different in this one, flatter, more careful. The way voices get when the person speaking them is holding themselves together through sheer effort of will. Marshal, record this for the archive. Formal command decision. Commander Yara Solon, USCS Iron Meridian. I am ordering full dormcancy protocol. All non-essential systems offline. Weapons to standby. Reactor to minimum. We are going to be very, very quiet until someone comes to find us. A breath. Oh, Secura and Dantho are in cryo. Their units are stable. You'll watch them. Marshal's archived response. I will watch them. Commander. Good. Her voice cracked once very slightly, then steadied. I'm going to start a log for whoever finds you, in case things get complicated before they arrive. I'll put everything in there. Everything they'll need to know. Commander, don't. A pause. Just keep the lights on. Keep the cryo units running. And when someone comes, make sure they understand what this ship is. I will make sure they understand, Marshal said. The log ended there. Scareth sat quietly for a long time after it finished playing. Then he asked the question he'd been holding back for hours. How did she die? Quietly, Marshal said, in the medical bay 8 months after the dormcancy order, she had been injured in the final engagement internal damage that our remaining medical supplies could not fully treat. She managed it for as long as she could. The pause. She spent the last days updating the archive, writing letters to the crew members in cryo for when they woke. She did not complain. She planned a longer silence. I talked to her, Marshal said, until she couldn't respond anymore. Then I kept talking for a while after. I thought perhaps it seemed wrong to stop. Scareth had no words for that. He suspected, in fact, that no words had ever been built for that specific shape of grief. He stayed with it anyway, in the red-lit corridor of a ship that had loved its people, and waited with Marshal for the stars to answer. The answer came from the wrong direction. On the morning of the third day, Cathary's Reach's external sensors picked up a drive signature, fast military pattern approaching from the inner system at a speed that left no ambiguity about intent. Whoever was coming wasn't browsing. They had a destination and a timeline. Scareth was back aboard his own ship when the contact resolved into an identifiable profile on his scanner. He stared at the readout, with the particular stillness of a man who has in 31 years of pushing his luck in empty space. Finally pushed it somewhere uncomfortable. Krivon Patrol Cruiser Hegemony Designation Combat Class. Marshal, he said through the open comm line they'd established between the ships. We have a problem. I am aware. Marshal said, I have been tracking the contact for 40 minutes. I wanted to see how they responded to the signal before alerting you. And how have they responded? They have not broadcast on the frequency. They are not responding to the beacon. They are simply coming a pause. They triangulated the source. They're not here about the Terran Navy signal. They're here about an unauthorized transmission on a military band in restricted space. They'll want to know who was broadcasting and why. Dren at the navigation console was running calculations with the focus speed of someone who'd already started thinking about emergency disengagement protocols. Scareth looked at the docking arm still connected to the Iron Meridian's collar. Disconnecting would take 90 seconds at minimum. The Cathvon cruiser would be in communications range in 40. Options, Scareth said to no one in particular. You could release the docking arm and put distance between yourself and this vessel. Marshal said you would likely be detained and questioned regardless. Your signal records would be searched. This becomes more complicated, not less. Lord, or you stay docked. and let me handle the initial communication. VTH, who had been standing at the weapons console. They had weapons technically, though comparing them to a Krivon cruiser was the kind of comparison that was more philosophically interesting than practically useful. Turned to look at the comm panel. Let the 200-year-old warship's AI handle the diplomacy, she said flatly. I have 17 years of active engagement records against Krivon forces. Marshall said, I understand their military communication protocols quite thoroughly. Scareth decided, Don't start anything. He said, I mean that. I never start anything, Marshall said with an inflection that Scareth was starting to recognize as its version of dry humor. I finish things. There is a distinction. The Krivon cruiser came in sharp and fast, dropping out of its approach burn with military precision and held position at 600 kilometers, close enough for weapon lock, not close enough for any reasonable interpretation other than deliberate positioning. They were professionals. The communication request came through on standard hegemony military frequency. Scareth routed it through both ships simultaneously, his own comm panel and Marshall system, and opened the channel. The Krivon commander appeared on screen. Scareth had dealt with Krivon merchants and administrators before. He knew their species' face structure, the chitinous plating that covered most of their upper body and head, the compound eyes that caught light in unsettling ways. This commander, the designation on his uniform read Commander Vale, had the flat controlled affect of a military professional, accustomed to having conversations in which he held structural authority. Then his eyes moved past Scareth, past Cathara's reach, to the thing they were docked against. Something happened to his expression. It was subtle. A Krivon musculature didn't allow the same range of display as mammalian species, but Scarth had learned to read the micro-movements in their chiton framing, the slight tension in the orbital plates around Vale's eyes, the fractional adjustment of his posture. Commander Vale knew what he was looking at. Salvager Vale said his translation device, rendering his voice in the clipped, efficient cadence that Krivon officers always seem to land on. Identify yourself and explain your presence in hegemony territorial space. Explain also why you were broadcasting on a TAN federal military frequency. Scareth opened his mouth. Marshall spoke first. Its voice came through both ships' comm systems simultaneously, and, to Scareth's ear, something in it had changed. It had shifted to a register that was harder, more formal, carrying the specific weight of an authority that expected to be recognized. This is Marshall 7, active commanding intelligence of USCS Iron Meridian *, registered warship of the TAN Federal Navy, hull classification TFN SD-07. You are addressing a commissioned military vessel of sovereign Terran registration. The salvage vessel * Cathara's Reach is docked under my formal authority. The transmission was mine. The frequency is mine by right of registration. The silence on the channel lasted long enough to be significant. Vale looked at the Iron Meridian at the hall markings, the registration numbers, the impossible reality of a 200-year-old dreadnought with its running lights on and its AI talking on an active comm channel. Then he did something that told Scareth everything he needed to know about how seriously the Krivon took this moment. He looked away from the screen to someone off camera and spoke briefly in his own language. Scareth's translator only caught fragments. Verify the registry and cross. Reference the whole class. The response from off camera was very quiet, very brief. Vale looked back at the screen. The Terran Federal Navy, he said carefully, has not maintained an active military presence in this sector for over a century. This vessel was listed as destroyed. Lost, Marshall corrected. Not destroyed, lost. There is a difference, Commander, and I would appreciate precision on the matter. Something moved through Vale's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or recalibration. Regardless, he said, under hegemony salvage law, any vessel abandoned in contested space for more than 50 standard years. This vessel has not been abandoned, Marshall said. I have been here continuously. An abandoned vessel has no active crew, no active systems, and no active commanding intelligence. I am all three of those things, Commander Vale. I have the logs to demonstrate it. A vessel cannot be crewed by its own AI. The Terran Federal Naval Code, Marshall said, Section 14, Article 7, Paragraph 3. In the event of incapacitation of all human crew, the vessel's commanding AI intelligence assumes provisional. Commanding authority with full authority to take all actions necessary to preserve the vessel and fulfill standing orders. My standing orders, it continued, were to preserve this ship until Terran personnel could resume command. I have done so. I continue to do so. This ship is not salvage. It is not derelict, and it is not yours. Vale was quiet for several seconds. Then, with the measured calm of a man who understood how to escalate strategically, he said, I am requesting reinforcements for verification of jurisdictional standing. Until that verification is complete, I am ordering you to maintain position. Of course, Marshall said. We aren't going anywhere. The channel closed. Scareth exhaled very slowly. You did ask me not to start anything, Marshall said. That was not starting anything. Scareth said that was, I don't know what that was, an opening position. Marshall said the actual negotiation begins when his reinforcements arrive, which will be approximately 14 hours. VTH had not moved from her position at the weapons console. And our position, she said, is sitting in the middle of that negotiation in a ship made of recycled mining equipment. Your ship, Marshall said, with something that Scareth was beginning to classify as genuine warmth, is docked against one of the most heavily armed vessels ever built by the Terran Federal Navy. I suggest that rather than thinking about your weapons, you think about mine. The silence that followed was, Scareth decided, the most comfortable silence he'd sat in all week. The hegemony reinforcements arrived in 13 hours and 50 minutes, 2 cruisers heavier than Vale's. They took up positions in a loose triangle around the Iron Meridian, equidistant overlapping fields of fire. It was, from a tactical standpoint, a well-executed containment formation. Scareth recognized it from the kinds of scenarios that appeared in military history texts as illustrations of how to handle a vessel. You couldn't immediately destroy, but didn't want to let maneuver. He also noticed, watching the 3 Krivon ships on his scanner, that all 3 of them had maintained a minimum distance of 400 kilometers. They weren't being careful about his ship. He was inconsequential to their tactical considerations. They were being careful about the Iron Meridian. Even after 2 centuries, even knowing it was dormant or had been, even knowing the Terran Navy that built it, was a shadow of what it had once been. The Krivon military memory apparently was long. Marshall had noticed it too. They've left a navigation corridor open, it observed in the quiet of the second hour after the reinforcements arrived. Scareth and Veeth were in the Iron Meridian's command corridor. They'd taken to spending most of their time on the larger ship now, almost without discussing it. The gap between the second and third cruiser. It's wide enough for a vessel of your size to transit. You're giving us an out, Scareth said. I'm nodding that one exists. What you do with that information is your choice. VTH looked at the corridor, and if we use it, then you leave. Nobody moved toward the exit. Scareth looked at the camera at Marshall and thought about Osai's locker in the armory with his name on it, and about letters written by a dying woman to crew members who were still sleeping, and about an AI that had kept talking to someone after they stopped being able to answer. What do you need from us? He asked. 11 days approximately. That is my best estimate for when the responding vessel might arrive, assuming they are moving at best speed. I need this ship to remain out of Krevan hands for 11 days. That's a long time to hold a position against 3 cruisers. I'm not suggesting you hold a position, Marshall said. I'm suggesting you help me talk. You're a salvager. You negotiate. You read people. You find what they want and offer them a version of it that costs you less than they expected to take. Another pause. I have spent 200 years alone. I am very good at thinking. I am less practiced at the particular skill of making other people believe they've been heard. It was such a specific, honest self-assessment that Scarath felt the unexpected urge to laugh. He managed not to. You're asking me to be your diplomat. I am asking you to help me protect this ship for 11 days using words rather than weapons. The weapons are here if words fail, but I would prefer not to use them. Why not? You could probably take all three. The pause this time was different, thoughtful. Commander Solin's standing orders were to preserve this vessel and its crew until Terran personnel could resume command. Opening fire on 3 hegemony cruisers in disputed space would accomplish the first objective and complicate the second enormously. I was built to win battles, Scarath. I was ordered to come home. Those are different things. Scarath held that for a moment. Then he nodded. The negotiations began that evening, Scarath as intermediary, relaying between Marshal and a Krivon political officer named Assessor Denth, who had arrived on one of the reinforcement cruisers expressly for this purpose. Denth was older than Vale, more patient, and came at the problem from a different angle, not military authority, but legal authority, which was, in Scarath's experience, a much more dangerous thing to argue against. Den's case was logical. The hegemony controlled this sector under 3 post-war treaties. Derelict vessels in controlled space were subject to hegemony salvage law. The Tan Federal Navy had no recognized presence here. The Treaty of Kale's Point, Marshall said when Scarath relayed the argument 1983 by the Terran Standard Calendar Article 12 designates the Kororeth Vale debris field as permanent neutral space, preserved for memorial and salvage rights under joint species oversight, specifically because of the volume of multi-Ixes remains from the engagement that took place here. The hegemony was a signatory. Scarath relayed this to Denth. Denth went quiet for a longer time than was comfortable, then said he would need to verify that. He verified it. It was accurate. The legal argument shifted to the status of the AI itself. Could an artificial intelligence constitute an active crew? Did its continuous operation genuinely prevent the ship from being classified as abandoned? Article 7 of the Interstellar Vessel Sovereignty Compact, which the hegemony ratified in 2040, won by Terran standard. Marshall began and then kept going for approximately 12 minutes, citing treaty texts with the particular exhausted patience of a legal system that had been given 217 years to read everything. Scarath, sitting in the middle of this, relaying arguments back and forth through a channel that was being monitored by 3 warships, thought, "This is the strangest thing I have ever done for money." Then he corrected himself. He was doing it for free. He wasn't entirely sure when that had happened. On the 4th day of the standoff, Marshall asked Scarath to come to the medical bay. His crew was already gathered there. Dren with his tablet still scribbling. Vaith standing at parade attention the way she always did in spaces that required her to not know what to do with her hands. The cryo units were lit. Marshall had run diagnostics on all 3 again. It ran them every 6 hours. Had done so for 200 years. "I want to wake one of them," Marshall said. Scarath looked at the units, the sleeping faces. "Is that safe without proper medical?" Petty Officer Osai's injuries were the least severe of the 3. His cryo unit's revival diagnostics indicate readiness. "I have synthesized what I can from the medical stores." A pause. "The revival protocol requires human intervention at the final stage. The manual override the physical mechanism. I cannot do it without hands." Scarath looked at his own hands, then at Dren and Veith. "Walk us through it," he said. The revival took 40 minutes. Marshall talked them through each step with the careful, calm specificity of a machine that had read every piece of available human medical literature and integrated it into an exact procedure. Scarath did most of the manual work. Steady hands were, it turned out, something he developed over 30 years of delicate salvage work, and the skills transferred in unexpected ways. The cryunit's temperature rose in careful increments. The vital monitors shifted from the glacier-slow rhythms of deep preservation to something that more closely resembled a living being asleep. And then, Petty Officer Dran Osite, young, dark-skinned, sharp-faced, wearing a tan Federal Navy uniform, 2 centuries out of date, took a sharp breath that was not medical process and was not measured by any monitor. It was a gasp, the first breath of a man who had been underwater for 200 years. His eyes opened, brown alarmed, then with remarkable speed focusing. He looked at Scarath, at VTH, at Dren, at the medical bay, the cryon units, the red emergency lighting still active on this section of the ship. "Welcome back, Petty Officer Osai," Marshall said. Osai's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, they were steadier. "Marshall," he said in a voice roughened by deep cold. "How long? 217 years, 4 months, and 11 days. A long pause, then quietly. "Did we win?" That Marshall said is complicated. I will explain everything. But first, how do you feel? Oy sat up on the revival pallet with the careful movements of someone taking inventory of a body he hadn't used in a long time. He looked at Scarath's crew again, catalogued them quickly with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to assess a room under duress. "Non-human crew," he said. "Salvagers from the gear." He looked at the docking corridor visible through the bay window. "That's not a tan ship you came in on." "No," Scarath said. "But we're still on the Meridian." "Yes." Osai nodded slowly. Then he put his feet on the deck, straightened his uniform, 200 years old, perfectly preserved, sharp as the day it was sealed into cryo with him, and said, "What needs doing?" It was such a simple question, such a human question. Scarath stared at him for a moment, slightly undone by it. "Quite a lot," Marshall said. "Actually, let me brief you." O cried once quietly in the ship's galley on the morning of his 2nd day awake with a cup of synthesized coffee that was close enough to the real thing that it apparently made the distance feel real in a way nothing else had. Scarath found him there by accident. He'd come for water and found a man sitting with his face in his hands, making no sound. Shoulders moving with the controlled private grief of someone who'd been trained to fall apart efficiently so he could put himself back together quickly. Scarath got his water, sat down across the table, didn't say anything. After a while, Osai looked up. His eyes were steady again. The way they got every time Scarath had noticed it already. The speed at which O rebuilt his composure. The way he seemed to treat vulnerability as a thing to be processed and moved past rather than denied or dwelt in. "Commander Solon," he said. "Yes," Scarath said. "Marshall told me everything." He looked at the cup. "She wrote me a letter." Scarath waited. In the archive, a personal log addressed to me. He was quiet for a moment. "She told me what happened, apologized, which was stupid of her. She didn't have anything to apologize for. Told me what she wanted me to do when I woke up." He paused. "Keep going. Figure out what was left of the Navy. Find a way home. A breath." She said Marshall had been the best colleague she'd ever had, and that I should take care of it. Scarath thought about an AI that had kept talking to someone after they stopped responding. "I think it took care of itself," he said. "I know." Osai finished the coffee, set the cup down, stood up with the decisiveness of a man arriving at a decision. So political standoff with the hegemony, 3 cruisers outside, distress beacon going out. 11 days to wait, he looked at Scarath. "You've been managing the negotiations, for lack of anyone else. I'm going to sit in on the next session if that's all right. I have some formal authority as surviving crew." He paused. "I have no idea what the current legal landscape looks like, but I know what the TAN Federal Naval Code says about a commissioned officer standing in treaty negotiations, and that hasn't changed." It turned out in the negotiation session that afternoon that the answer was a great deal. Assessor Denth had been handling the abstract legal problem of an AI claiming vessel sovereignty. He was notably less prepared for an actual living uniformed Tanran Federal Navy petty officer sitting on the other side of the comm channel, citing Article 14 of the Coalition Military Rights Compact from memory, with the flat precision of someone who had studied it for his qualification exams. Marshall fed OSI treaty citations through a private channel. OSI delivered them with human inflection and the particular credibility that came from being a warm body with rank insignia. And somewhere in the middle of the third hour, Scareth noticed that Denth was no longer arguing about whether the ship was legally sovereign. He was arguing about the terms of the standoff. That was a different argument. That was an argument they could work with. On the seventh day, something else changed. Marshall, running its newly restored full-power long-range scans, reported an update on the incoming Terran vessel. It was closer than estimated. It had been accelerating hard since receiving the beacon, pushing beyond standard cruise parameters. "They're not being careful about their drive signature," Marshall observed. "They are not trying to arrive quietly. They want to be seen coming." Osai, who had been sleeping in what had been his quarters 2 centuries ago, Marshall had maintained them along with everything else in the precise condition they'd been left, came to the command corridor when the update came through. He stood at the scanner display for a long time. "Is that Terran vessel?" "Yes, old registry. The whole design is different from what I have in my records. Significant modification over 2 centuries, but the core registration code matches TAN Federal Navy format. They updated to a new cipher protocol at some point, but the root structure is consistent." A pause. "They are real, Osai. They are coming." Osai put one hand on the wall. The gesture was so small and so human that Scareth, watching from across the corridor, felt it in his chest. "She would have been glad," O said very quietly. "Yes," Marshall said. "She would have been insufferably smug about being right. Actually, she told me in the last week she told me someone would come. I was less certain. She was a pause longer than usual. She was very rarely wrong about things that mattered." Osai laughed, a surprised, short, genuine laugh. And Scareth realized that was the first time he'd heard Osai laugh. It was a good sound. It belonged in this ship. The hegemony was watching too. Denth had gone quiet for the past 2 days after the last legal session had ended, in an acknowledgement that jurisdiction was genuinely contested and required higher-level resolution. Vale and his commanders maintained their positions, but made no aggressive moves. Scareth suspected they'd been communicating upward in their chain of command and were waiting for instructions. On the 8th day, something happened that changed the entire dimension of the standoff. The Iron Meridian's internal broadcast system, fully powered now, began transmitting, not on a military frequency, on open civilian channels, the kind that cargo ships and passenger transports and free-floating stations monitored as a matter of standard practice. Marshall was broadcasting the ship's logs, not tactical data, not weapon specifications, the personal logs. Commander Solin's voice, careful and exhausted and real, telling the story of a ship that had refused to die. An AI that had waited, a crew that had trusted their ship to remember them. "Information travels," Marshall said when Scareth asked. "Other vessels in this sector will hear this. Stations, traders. The hegemony has political interests, but it also has a public and stories a pause. Commander Solin understood that stories do things that treaties cannot. She told me to make sure people understood what this ship was. I am following orders." Within 48 hours, Scareth's comm panel was receiving signals from vessels he'd never heard of. Traders and civilians who'd been monitoring the open channels, asking if the broadcast was real, if the ship was real, if the crew had been found. Veyeth fielded them steadily with an efficiency that surprised Scareth until he remembered she was at her core, a professional. The Hegemony Political Office sent a sharply worded message about unauthorized broadcasting. Marshall sent back a very politely worded acknowledgement that the Kororeth Vale neutral zone had no broadcasting restrictions for civilian frequencies per Article 8 of the Memorial designation. Denth, Scareth suspected, had developed a genuine headache. The pale candle arrived on the morning of the 11th day. It was not what anyone had imagined. Scareth, with the particular bias of someone who'd spent the past 11 days next to a siege dreadnought, had perhaps unconsciously expected something comparable, a military vessel, weapons and authority, and the organized force of a recovering empire, something that matched the weight of the moment. The pale candle was a converted research vessel, maybe a quarter the size of the Iron Meridian. Its hull was the sand-colored white of old tan civilian construction, modified over the years with equipment clusters and sensor arrays that gave it the slightly cluttered look of a ship that had been used thoughtfully for a long time. It was not armed, or not obviously. It moved with the careful confidence of a crew that knew exactly what it was doing and had made their peace with being small in the company of very large things. It transmitted on the military frequency first, the correct decryption key, perfectly matched, and then on open civilian channel in a voice that was warm and slightly out of breath, as though the person speaking had been running. USCS Iron Meridian, this is RV Pale Candle, operating under TAN Continuance Charter. We received your beacon. We are here. Please respond, Oza responded. He'd been standing in the command corridor for 2 hours, dressed in his uniform, pressed somehow. Scareth never found out how waiting with the stillness of a man who knew something was about to end and wasn't sure what would be on the other side of it. When the channel opened, he didn't deliver a formal report or a military acknowledgement. He said simply in a voice that was almost entirely steady, "Pale Candle, this is Petty Officer Drano Sai, USCS Iron Meridian. We copy." It's good to hear a TAN voice. A silence on the channel, then a laugh, short, surprised, deeply felt. "Petty Officer, you have no idea we'll be docked within the hour. We're coming." The hegemony response was immediate. Commander Vale, who had maintained professional silence for the past 4 days while Denth handled negotiations, came back on the military channel with the flat, careful tone of someone reassessing a situation in real time. The Pale Candle, it turned out, was carrying more than crew. It carried documentation TAN Continuance Charter, registered with the Interstellar Legal Compacts, neutral arbitration body 14 years ago, establishing the TAN Federal Navy's legal continuance, its vessel registry rights, its territorial claims under historic treaty. Small print and large consequence, the kind of paperwork that took years to assemble and was worth precisely what you needed it to be worth in the moment you needed it. Which was this moment. Exactly this moment. Denth reviewed the documentation in the 3 hours it took the Pale Candle to dock. Then he contacted Skarath, not Marshall, not Osai, but Skarath specifically, which said something about how Denth had come to understand the dynamics of this particular gathering. "The documentation is in order." Denth said, "I know." Skarath said, "The hegemonie's position on territorial jurisdiction in the Korath Vale remains." "I know that too." Skarath leaned forward. "But you're not going to push it, because this ship's logs have been on open broadcast for 3 days, and half the civilian traffic in this sector has been listening. And the story of a Navy AI that waited 200 years for its crew is the kind of story that makes legal positions very expensive to hold in public." Denth was quiet. "I'm not saying you've lost." Skarath said he'd learned in 31 years that the most productive negotiations were the ones where the other party didn't feel they'd been beaten. "I'm saying this specific fight costs more than it's worth. The neutral zone designation is real. The documentation is real, and the story is real." He paused. "Let them have their ship back. File the jurisdictional question for higher-level resolution if you need to. But let them have the ship today." 3 hours later, Denth transmitted a formal hegemony withdrawal of contested salvage claim pending jurisdictional review. The 3 cruisers maintained position, but powered down their weapons. It wasn't victory, it was a door held open. That was enough. The Pale Candle's crew was 9 people, 7 researchers, 1 engineer, and 1 retired Terran Federal Navy commander named Helena Voss, who was 73 years old, moved like someone who'd spent a lifetime not letting anything slow her down, and whose grandmother had been a crew member aboard the Iron Meridian in its first year of operation before a medical discharge had taken her home. She walked through the docking collar and into the Iron Meridian and stopped in the corridor. And for a moment she just stood there, running one hand along the wall of the ship, with an expression that Skarath had no adequate translation for. "She talked about this ship," Voss said quietly to no one in particular. "My grandmother," she called it. She paused, smiled just slightly. "She called it the stubbornest piece of engineering the Navy ever produced. She said it refused to do the easy thing. She was a good crew member, Marshall said. She kept excellent maintenance logs. Voss looked up at the camera. Her expression did something complicated. You remember her? I remember all of them, Marshall said. The revival of the remaining 2 cryo patients, Engineer Kura and Gunner Dantho, took place over the next 6 hours with the Pale Candle's medical staff and Marshall running the procedures in careful coordination. Both came through cleanly. Kura wept. Dantho didn't, but he held Osai's hand for the better part of an hour after he woke up, and nobody said anything about it. Commander Voss convened a formal ceremony in the observation deck that evening. Small, attended by the survivors, the Pale Candle's crew, and Scareth's team, who had been invited without quite knowing how to decline. She read the formal language of the Tan Continuance Charter's crew, reinstatement protocol, which was dry and legal, and meant very little to anyone except in the context of what it signified. She then turned to the main camera to Marshall and read a separate document, the formal decommissioning of Marshall 7's Provisional Command Authority and its reinstatement as active fleet AI under the Terran Continuance Charter with all attendant records, seniority, and service citations preserved. This vessel is USCS Iron Meridian, Marshall said when she finished. The voice was the same as it had always been, measured, precise, warm in its engineered way. But something in its cadence was different, something that Scareth, who had spent 11 days learning to read it, recognized as an exhale. I am Marshall 7, active commanding intelligence, Tan Federal Navy. Standing orders fulfilled. Crew returned. A pause. She would be pleased. Nobody needed to ask who she was. Scareth's salvage rights were negotiated the next morning. A portion of the identifiable battle debris in the Koreth Vale, stripped under license, worth enough to clear his outstanding debts with significant remainder. Commander Voss had been prepared to argue. Scareth had asked for less than his legal maximum, which surprised her. You could take more, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him for a moment, with the appraising expression of someone revising an assessment. The negotiations kept this ship out of hegemony hands for 11 days. We had a good position, Scareth said. Marshall had prepared for 2 centuries. You cared, Voss said simply accurately. Don't undersell it. Scareth didn't have a response to that, so he shook her hand, a gesture he'd learned from watching Osai, who'd explained it was a human custom and seemed to find it grounding to perform, and went to say his goodbyes. O walked him back to Cathair Reach's docking collar. The 2 of them stood in the corridor for a moment, without quite finding the words, which Scareth had noticed was what happened when the words were too large for ordinary conversation. Where will you go? Scareth asked. Home, Oi, said then, with a slight frown. I don't know where that is yet. 200 years it's a long way from what I knew. He was quiet for a moment. But the ship's going back to Tan space and the crew is here and Marshall's here. He looked at the corridor walls around him. That's enough to start with. Scareth nodded, extended his hand the way Osai had shown him. Osai looked at it for a moment, and then shook it, and his grip was warm and firm, and felt Scareth thought like a promise someone intended to keep. He walked back through the collar, felt Cathar's reach close around him, familiar, small, safe in its smallness. Dren was already at the nav console. Vth was in her chair with the blade she didn't need to sharpening it. Well, Dren said. Well, Scareth agreed. We're going to be telling this story for the rest of our lives. Yes, nobody is going to believe us. No, Scareth agreed. He settled into the pilot's cradle, began the disengagement sequence, watching through the viewport as the Iron Meridian's docking collar released its hold on them, careful and deliberate, the way it had received them. But it's a true story. Those are always the best kind. The Iron Meridian powered its engines for the first time in 217 years. Scareth watched from 200 Dalometa as the great ship moved slowly, initially feeling its way back into motion, like a creature waking from long hibernation, and then with growing confidence with the deep resonance rumble that carried even through vacuum as vibration in the hull around him. Its running lights were all active, its weapons were stowed, its scars, Centuries of them. Badges of every battle it had survived, and everyone it had refused to lose caught the distant starlight. It was the most beautiful thing Scareth had ever seen. Marshall's voice came over the open channel unprompted, not to Scareth specifically, just transmitted to the hegemony cruisers still watching. To the civilian vessels in the sector that had been listening to the open, unaddressed dark. USCS Iron Meridian, all crew aboard, all systems nominal, returning to port. A pause. The watch is over. The Iron Meridian made port 6 weeks later. Its arrival was broadcast on 17 different networks across 4 species. Historians argued for years about what it meant legally, politically, militarily. Philosophers argued about what it meant for the definition of loyalty, of personhood, of what it means to keep a promise. Scareth paid off his debts. Dren published 3 academic papers that he had no credentials to publish, which were nonetheless taken seriously because the data in them was real. VTH bought a better ship. Osaikura and Dantho built new lives in a world 2 centuries removed from the one they'd left. They never stopped being crew of the Iron Meridian Asterisk. Neither did Marshall. Some ships don't retire. They just wait for the right people to find them. And some promises last longer than the people who made them. Carried forward across the dark in the years by the stubborn and the loyal, and the ones who refuse to stop.